This is the McKinsey Podcast, where we help you make sense out of our world's toughest business challenges.
Welcome to the show. I'm Lucia Rahili.
And I'm Roberta Fusaro.
What we were really surprised by when we first did the research back in 2020 is that clean and natural was actually beating out clinical in many subcategories. And in the more recent research, we saw moving much more towards clinical, effective, science-backed being the most important priorities that consumers have.
That's McKinsey partner Anna Pione. She's talking about how consumer tastes are changing when it comes to wellness products, and demand is growing. In fact, McKinsey's latest research says wellness is a $1.8 trillion industry worldwide, with no signs of slowing.
In our second segment, well-intentioned counsel sometimes misses the mark. McKinsey senior partner Gayatri Shenai shares how she failed to recognize a colleague's cry for help.
Anna, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thanks so much for having me, Roberta.
I have so many questions for you today, like why I have become addicted to my fitness tracker, for one. But I do want to start with the numbers. McKinsey did some global research. It's actually a piece of recurring research on the future of wellness, where you surveyed more than 5,000 consumers in the US, the UK, and China on how they're thinking about wellness. What were we looking to measure with this report?
We started this research back in 2020 because we were getting a lot of questions from investors and companies around this concept of wellness. Is it something that would be sustaining? Is it something that they should think about investing behind? And so we decided to launch this research to really understand how consumers around the world are approaching their health and wellness and how that's evolved, what they're looking for, and therefore how companies and brands can better evolve their offerings to meet consumer needs.
What are the main categories that consumers are investing in, and how much are they investing?
Yeah, so we're seeing a lot of investment by consumers, and we're seeing that prioritization continue to grow. The way that we define and think about wellness is informed by what we're hearing from the consumers that we spoke to, those 5,000 people that we talked to globally. And we segment wellness across 6 different dimensions: better health, better fitness, better sleep, better mindfulness, better appearance, and better nutrition.
Are these dimensions a big deal equally for citizens across the globe? Or are there huge regional differences?
We knew that consumers were treating wellness as a priority and that was increasing. What we were surprised by, and what we continue to be surprised by every year, is how much of a priority that is perceived to be. And just to give you some numbers against it, this year, 82% of consumers in the US, 73% in the UK, and 87% in China reported wellness as a top or important priority in their life. And what we find even more striking is the focus keeps going up. More than half of consumers say they prioritize wellness more than they did a year ago.
Do these wellness priorities and the wellness spending, Anna, do they vary by age or demographic? I know you talked about the regional differences. Do we see differences between, say, Gen Z versus millennials versus baby boomers?
It's really all consumers that are thinking about their wellness and prioritizing it when you think about the numbers that we just shared. That said, what we have seen consistently in our research is that millennials are the most enthusiastic generation when it comes to both spend and participation across different types of product and service offerings. But this year, what we were really interested to see is Gen Z really stepping into prominence. And we think this is a group to watch going forward.
The report is rich with data on current trends, and it identifies 7 areas in which we're seeing technological advances and increased consumer interest and innovation. We only have so much time today, unfortunately, so we're going to focus on 4 of these areas in particular: healthy aging, weight management, gut health, and sleep. So I want to start with healthy aging. How much of a priority is it based on our research results?
Healthy aging is a really big priority. And what we've seen is this matters from both a societal as well as a consumer perspective. From a societal perspective, old age dependency ratio will have tripled between 1950 and 2050. And the McKinsey Health Institute, our internal research arm, suggests that boosting quality of life while managing age-related disease will be critical. And that in order to do this, we're really going to need a holistic approach to move the needle. On the consumer side, we see that over 60% of people have said it's extremely or very important to purchase longevity products, and 70% are planning to buy more products in the future.
What are the types of interventions that we're talking about, or the products that we're talking about?
We see a lot of this in the supplement space in particular. So products, for example, like CoQ10 might be more geared towards an older demographic versus different types of supplements might be geared towards younger consumers aiming for longevity. We also see it in the beauty space and in different types of services that are more cutting edge across the health space, particularly when targeting an older consumer. What we've found is the key thing to keep in mind is to focus on the need state or the aspiration of what is being accomplished through the offering versus the aging process itself. Versus for a younger consumer, what we find is a focus on prevention tends to be a more effective angle to help consumers feel like their needs are being met.
I'm curious whether the research suggests why we're seeing a little bit of an uptick among younger consumers in their attention to this topic. Is it just more, is it better marketing? Is it that, do we have any sense of that from the research?
Our hypothesis here and what we've heard from consumers would suggest that there may be some element of the COVID-19 pandemic coming into play here, where there was this massive shock to many people's lives, and in such a way that it really made people much more conscious of their health and what they could do to be proactive about taking their health into their own hands and living a long and healthy life. And so we do think this is something that had been gaining momentum even prior to COVID. But what we saw is during COVID, a lot of these concepts really took hold and accelerated in a way that we hadn't seen previously.
What are the implications for companies that are trying to reach consumers with these healthy aging products? How should they look at these data and what should they do differently?
Yeah, there's a couple of implications here. So one is revisiting their portfolio of products and services and thinking about what types of offerings they have and where there might be gaps from a healthy aging or a longevity perspective that they could bring to the market. The second one is really thinking critically around how they manage their messaging and communication to consumers. Again, especially for an older consumer, messaging around how they are getting older is not one that really resonates. It's much more around what you're going to help that consumer do and what are the things that you're going to help them improve in their life that we find tends to resonate much more strongly.
I know I don't want to be reminded constantly that I am getting older, so that makes perfect sense.
Same.
Okay. So according to the report, 1 in 3 adults struggle with obesity in the United States. What did the research show in terms of its importance?
This was one that has come up time and time again in our research as a need state that is really critical for consumers. It's one that, again, matters from both a societal as well as a consumer perspective. As you mentioned, we see in the U.S. in particular, so many adults struggling with obesity. In our survey, we also see that 60% of consumers are seeking a weight management solution. So this is something that people have very top of mind and they want to prioritize it, but it's just really hard to act upon it and make those changes. And so that's where we see opportunities for companies and brands to step in and help consumers achieve their goals.
So what kinds of opportunities are we talking about? Which weight loss interventions are really resonating with folks?
Fitness has always been near the top of the list in terms of things that people try when they're seeking to lose weight. And that's something that we've seen in the past and we expect to continue as just a very established link between those two categories. Historically, the other types of interventions in the category were a bit more mature. So we saw things like weight loss programs and weight loss supplements being much more established, mature categories, fairly sizable, but not in growth stage. Maybe 5 to 10 or more years ago, we saw some new offerings around things like juice cleanses becoming much more mainstream and easily accessible, as well as healthier meal kits. What has changed more recently is prescription medication. That's been a real evolution to the category very recently in the last just couple of years. When we did our research, prescription weight loss offerings in the US at least are now the most highly regarded in terms of effectiveness of what they seek to do. It's probably still too early to say how that will evolve, but we do think it will be interesting to look out for the complementary product and service offerings that may spring up to help consumers meet their health and nutrition needs while they're taking GLP-1 prescription medication, as well as complementary supplements. So things like nutrition bars that help consumers meet their macro needs, or lifestyle coaching services that help consumers ensure that they're getting the right, nutrients or fitness routine around their medication. In parallel, this is where I'd link in a few of the trends that we saw in our research around consumers using biomonitoring to really understand their health and tailor their activities to better optimize for that, as well as personalization, and in particular, Gen AI as a tool to help companies better personalize their offering. I think one of the biggest manifestation of this is in the wearables category. Wearables are incredibly popular right now as it relates to tracking your health, your fitness, and your sleep. What we've seen in our research is that consumers would love to have a wearable that helps them with their nutrition or with weight management, but there just aren't offerings on the market today that are as easy to use as the ones around health, fitness, and sleep. So we do think if companies can come up with some kind of wearable offering that helps consumers with nutrition in a meaningful way that is much more passive than what's on the market today, that could be really interesting and really help people move the needle. And the other thing that we think could be interesting and that we're already starting to see is weaving Gen AI equipped recommendations into things like diet plans, coaching regimes, fitness plans, things like that, to really help tailor those plans to individual consumers.
Okay, I'm gonna again shift us away into one of our other categories or topics, and that's gut health, which honestly, Anna, it wasn't an issue that I had expected to find in the report. I'm not sure why. I guess I don't think a lot about gut health. Why is this, a popular topic right now?
It is really interesting to see that gut health and digestive supplements have been some of the more consistently strong growth subcategories within that space. If we go back to our survey data, over 80% of consumers in China, the UK, and the US consider gut health to be important, and over 50% anticipate making it a higher priority over the next few years. What we see is in the US and China, probiotic supplements so a vitamin or a pill, are the most popular form of treatment. In the UK, it's more of a nutrition-based approach. So we see consumers prioritizing probiotic-rich foods such as yogurt or kombucha more heavily. Mm-hmm. As we think about what the category could look like in the future, what we do see is quite a few players coming to market with at-home microbiome testing that helps inform consumers of what their unique gut health and gut needs are, and then linking that with more health-based offerings to meet those needs. In many cases, these companies partner closely with medical professionals to help inform their recommendations. And that links again with the trend that we saw around the rise of the doctor recommendation, or the increasing importance of and influence of doctor recommendations when it comes to consumers deciding what products to buy.
Sleep. This is something that I constantly think about and never get enough of. Yeah. And I imagine others are feeling that way. What did you see in the research?
Yeah, this is one that is very much do as I say, not as I do, because I will be the first to admit, I think sleep is so important and do not prioritize it nearly as much as I should in my life. The challenge that we've seen with consumers tackling their sleep, and one that I'm sure we're both well familiar with, is just the sheer number of factors that can affect a good night's sleep. You have diet, exercise, caffeination, screen time, stress, other lifestyle factors. We've seen that it's really hard for any one brand to bring an offering to the market that helps consumers move the needle across all of those things. And they're so interlinked. And this is where we get excited and say, it's not something that is necessarily fully fleshed out on the market today, but we think there is a massive opportunity if a company is able to come in and really help consumers figure that out in a much more holistic and comprehensive way.
What are some examples of interventions or treatments that are becoming more popular? Like, how are companies starting to tackle the sleep problem?
So we do see some relatively mature subcategories within the sleep market. Think of things like melatonin supplements or mattresses. There's quite a few categories that are already sizable at scale with a number of players. There probably is some room still for innovation there, where we do see companies coming in with new or different offerings that try to kind of tweak what's available and either message to consumers or bring new science an interesting way to consumers that helps them meet their needs. We've also seen a lot around things that help the environment of sleep, a dark room without distractions, the right type of lighting or lack thereof. So we are seeing a lot of interesting innovation in this space, but I do think this is one where what we find so compelling is how much consumers prioritize it. This is the second most prioritized dimension behind health only. And how much consumers express that what's available on the market today isn't quite enough for what they'd like to see to meet their needs.
Taking the research as a whole, which of the trends did you find most surprising?
What we were really surprised by when we first did the research back in 2020 is that clean and natural was actually beating out clinical in many subcategories, and many that we were surprised. So for example, in supplements, globally, consumers were more likely to say they'd prioritize clean and natural over clinical effectiveness if they were forced to choose between the two. What we've been then again surprised by in more recent years is that pendulum has really swung in the other direction. And in the more recent research, we saw moving much more towards clinical, effective, science-backed being the most important priorities that consumers have.
Any hypothesis for why that's the case?
I think it's just a recognition by consumers that you want the product you're taking to work and you're taking it for a reason. I think there is a few sub-trends underlying this. One is the inflation environment over the last couple of years has made consumers increasingly conscious of what they spend their money on. They want to make sure it works. I think the other sub-trend that we're seeing is there is an element of this, at least a baseline standard of clean ingredients. We see this especially in the supplement space and in the beauty space that consumers expect is almost more of table stakes at this point. But then when they're thinking about what's going to get them to decide to actually make a purchase of this brand over another brand, it's the clinical effectiveness that's going to move the needle for them.
Yeah, which makes sense. Bottom line results.
Exactly.
Anna, what about in-home care and at-home testing? What's changing there? I just feel like it's something that I've been hearing about for years.
This concept of in-home care is one that gets me particularly excited. If you think about what in-home care looked like prior to the pandemic, you're right in that it's always been around, but it was a much more narrow specific need state. You have, over-the-counter medicine, and then you have things like insulin tests or blood pressure cuffs. If a consumer had a specific condition and a specific doctor recommendation to monitor it, they would. What we've seen change, and again, I think this is another one that the pandemic has heavily influenced, is consumers using at-home care as a means to more proactively manage and control their health. We see this with increasing usage of telemedicine. this is, again, one where, prior to the pandemic, telemedicine did exist, but the pandemic really normalized and got consumers much more comfortable with accessing their health via telemedicine for services where it, makes sense to do so. The other area that I've seen really come into prevalence is this concept of at-home testing. We've just seen a real increase in tests for things like both STDs as well as more kind of, again, preventative health needs. So things like the microbiome testing or testing for different vitamin needs or things like that.
What's the impact of generative AI on the wellness trends that we've talked about here?
Gen AI is so interesting in terms of how quickly it's been evolving and how quickly the different types of applications and use cases have really sprung up in the last couple of years. As we mentioned earlier, I think the most immediate and clear translation of Gen AI to the wellness space is in some of these connected devices and app-based coaching services. So it allows for that hyper-personalization. I think you could see some interesting applications going forward that are a little bit less front and center for the consumer. So things like if you could use Gen AI in development of medication or supplements or over-the-counter products that could be more effective or more bioavailable for consumers, and you use Gen AI techniques to speed up the research or clinical testing process, I think that could also be really interesting. We also see it potentially in the beauty space where Gen AI could help consumers, maybe remove some friction points around what type of skincare to recommend or making virtual try-on services more sophisticated or things like that.
Mm-hmm. I know McKinsey has done a ton of work on women's health. How does this research relate to the previous studies that we've done?
One thing that just really came through in our more recent research is how critical women's health is to the overall consumer health landscape. And this particularly comes through from an investor, from a brand perspective. We're seeing that the women's health space was just, historically underserved and underfunded. And more recently, we've been seeing much more focus and interest and awareness of the importance of the different subcategories, things like from menopause to period care to pregnancy and fertility to just general women's health. Menopause in particular is one that gets me really excited. We've seen a lot of new supplements and both healthcare as well as more consumer-facing offerings to help consumers in that stage of their life, where historically this is something that affects women for a very long period of time in a very concentrated and intense way, and for which there historically was not a lot of things to help consumers through that process. It's a really underserved market. And I think now we're seeing just much more willingness to discuss, invest behind, normalize what women are going through during these stages. And therefore, it's opened up a lot of opportunity for brands to come in and meet those consumer needs.
This is critical stuff. So Anna, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. I still am going to ping you offline to talk to you about my tracker and what I can do to improve the number of steps I'm getting every day. So maybe we could talk more about that. Really appreciate you joining the podcast today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Next up, McKinsey senior partner Gayatri Shenai shares the humility it took to recognize a colleague was in crisis.
During the pandemic, we were working through a project and I had a colleague from a European office on my team. Everything seemed to be humming along really well. It was a dream project. And I remember one of my one-on-ones with this team member where we were catching up on how things were going, how he was feeling, what could we do differently. And he told me he was really enjoying us working together. But towards the end, he also confided in me that while the project was going well, he was staying up at night thinking about the project. I brushed it aside at that time, thinking, this guy's taking things way too seriously. So my guidance and recommendation to him was chill a bit. I encourage him to not take things so seriously, to relax. In hindsight, unfortunately, what I realized is I had failed to catch the thread of a mental health challenge. Long story short, it was not too much later when he called me and he said, I have to leave. I have to stop working. I'm grappling with almost no sleep over the last couple of weeks, and I realize I need to seek professional help. But the reason this story stays with me is, as a leader who prides herself on being a people developer, on being a people first leader, even I got it wrong. And I have to pause and reflect on how much I am still learning on the dimension of health and wellness and the power of asking questions versus making assumptions.
Thanks so much for listening to the McKinsey Podcast. I'm Lucia Rahili.
And I'm Roberta Fusaro.
Find us on McKinsey.com. We'll have a transcript of this episode up shortly.
And download the McKinsey Insights app, where you can find this podcast and other helpful content updated daily.
If you enjoyed the show, we'd love for you to leave a rating and a review.
We'll see you in 2 weeks.